Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight we slip into a low, lamplight world where the air smells like wet clay and river reeds, and the stars hang over the plains like tiny pin pricks pressed into a dark blanket. You can almost hear the slow gulp of the Euphrates, that steady drink, drink, drink sound, while somewhere a night watchman clears his throat and immediately regrets it because, yes, sound carries out here. And listen, you probably won't survive this if you expect a clean superhero story with a neat villain, because Mesopotamian's gods are basically a family group chat that never stopped. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love imagining all of us scattered across the planet, blinking in the same sleepy rhythm. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a city that does not glow with neon. It glows with baked brick that has stored up heat all day and is now slowly sighing it back into the night. The streets are narrow. The walls are high. The doorways are low enough that you instinctively duck, even though nobody is watching you. Somewhere nearby, a potter's kiln ticks as it cools. A dog pads past, pauses to judge you silently, and then decides you are not worth the effort. This is the kind of place where stories are not just entertainment. Stories are wiring. They connect river to field, temple to palace, thundercloud to tax season. And in this wiring, two names keep sparking. Enki and Enlil, not enemies in the way a movie would insist on. Not best friends either. More like brothers who share a house big enough to be the universe, and still manage to bump shoulders in every hallway. You walk toward the temple quarter, because in Sumerian cities the temple is not tucked away like a private chapel. It is a mountain made by hands, a staged hill in a flat world. The ziggurat rises in tiers, steps stacked like a promise. At night it feels even taller, because shadows stretch the angles. The priests have gone quiet, but the place is never truly asleep. Oil lamps burn, incense lingers. A scribe somewhere is still awake, scratching reeds against clay with the determination of someone who knows deadlines were invented long before email. Mainstream historical fact slid gently into your palm like a warm stone. These people, in cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, are among the earliest to leave us extensive writing in cuneiform, pressed into clay tablets. The writing is not only about gods. It is about barley rations, land boundaries, marriage contracts, and the kind of administrative detail that makes you realize humanity has always been obsessed with receipts. But the gods are in there too, threaded through the practical stuff like a watermark. You find a courtyard where a shallow basin reflects the moon. Water here is not decoration, it is life, threat, currency, and miracle. The rivers can feed you, and they can also decide to rearrange your entire existence overnight. That is why Enki feels close in a place like this. Enki is the god tied to sweet water, to the underground freshwater abyss called the Absu, to wisdom that flows and seeps and finds cracks. When people talk about him, you feel the tone shift, like someone is leaning in to share a clever trick that might save your life. But you also feel another presence in the air, in the way the wind moves over rooftops and makes reed mats shiver. That's Enlil. Not sweet water, not hidden springs. Enlil is air and storm and authority, the kind of force you cannot negotiate with when it arrives. His domain is not the quiet trickle under the ground. His domain is what sweeps across the plain and reminds you that roofs are optional if the sky gets angry enough. You do not need to pick a side yet. The point tonight is to understand why their conflict becomes so memorable. And right away you can sense it is not a simple good brother and bad brother situation. It is more like two different answers to the same problem. How do you run a world that keeps trying to become chaos? You drift through the city like a thought, and you catch the rhythm of daily life, even at night. A woman closes shutters with a soft thud. A child coughs in sleep. A guard taps his spear against the ground. Not because he sees danger, but because boredom is dangerous in its own way. You realize the gods are not distant concepts here. They are management. They are weather. They are law. They are the explanation for why your field failed and why your neighbor's field did not. In the stories, Enki and Enlil are brothers in a divine family tree that shifts depending on which tradition you are reading and which city is doing the telling. This matters. Historians still argue whether some of these relationships are original beliefs or later theological rearrangements, because different cities had different favorite gods, and scribes were not above updating a myth the way someone updates a resume. Same job, better title. You step closer to the scribal house, and you can almost hear the soft mutter of a student practicing signs. The student's hand cramps. The student keeps going. The student knows that a single wedge pressed wrong can turn grain into complaint. And honestly, both are realistic topics. On these tablets, Enlil often appears in a role that feels official, like the god who makes decrees, who holds the authority of the divine assembly. His name is woven into the idea of command. Enlil can be the one whose word sets the order of things, which is comforting if you like order, and terrifying if you are currently on the wrong side of a decree. Enki, on the other hand, often feels like the one who knows how to bend a decree without snapping it. He is associated with wisdom, with crafts, with cleverness. In some tales, he is the one who hands humanity tools and techniques. He is the voice that says, yes, rules matter, but have you considered a loophole? And you can practically hear Enlil sighing across the cosmos. Because if there is one thing a strict administrator hates, it is a loophole. You walk past a canal where the water moves slowly, reflecting broken fragments of moonlight like shattered pottery. You imagine Enki here, smiling at the canal's patient persistence. You imagine Enlil above in the moving air, unseen but undeniable. Two brothers occupying different layers of the same night. A quirky or fringed tidbit slides into the scene, but softly, like a whispered rumor you do not have to believe to enjoy. In modern fringe circles, Enki and Enlil sometimes get recast as rival alien figures in Anunnaki narratives, with their conflict turned into a cosmic political thriller. It is the kind of theory that thrives on the internet at 2 Mamma mia, when everyone is half awake and the algorithm is feeling mischievous. It is not how the ancient sources present them, but it is a modern echo that shows how sticky their personalities are. People still feel compelled to map them onto a battle of ideologies. If you have ever watched a comment section argue about who is really the hero, congratulations. You're participating in a tradition as old as clay. You turn toward the great temple precinct, where offerings were made earlier in the day. The air still carries hints of beer and bread and animal fat, the smell of a society that feeds its gods the way it feeds its guests. The gods, in return, are expected to keep the universe from falling apart. It is a contract, and the contracts, as any ancient scribe would tell you, are serious business. You start to sense that the brother conflict is not born from personal pettiness. It is born from function. Enlil represents the structure that keeps the city from becoming a brawl with walls. Enki represents the adaptability that keeps the city from becoming a prison made of its own rules. If one dominates too much, people suffer. If the other dominates too much, people suffer differently. The tension is almost inevitable. like trying to choose between a locked door and an open window during a storm. Somewhere, a gust of wind slips through the alley and lifts dust in a little swirl. You imagine Enlil's breath, impatient, tidying the street with force. A moment later, the dust settles into the canal water and drifts away. You imagine Enki's patience, letting the mess move where it can without breaking anything. You pause beside a wall where someone has pressed a small votive into the mud brick, a simple act of devotion. You think about the people here, most of whom will never travel far beyond the river valley. Yet their gods are cosmic. Their myths stretch across the sky. The brothers' argument, whatever it is, will matter to farmers and kings alike. Because in this worldview, divine family drama is not gossip. It is weather, policy, and survival. And already, without anyone announcing it, you feel the first spark. It is the sensation that the world is big enough for both brothers, but their methods keep colliding. Authority versus ingenuity, decree versus workaround, wind that commands versus water that persuades. You keep walking, letting the night cradle you. The city feels like it is holding its breath, waiting for tomorrow's heat. In the distance, a temple bell rings once, just a single note, as if to say, yes, the gods are still awake, and so are their problems. And you are here now, drifting closer to the place where those problems begin to look like a story. You keep moving as if the city is gently pushing you forward, one warm brick at a time, and the night air has that faint taste of smoke and river damp. The first section has left you with two presences in your mind, wind and water, rule and work around. And now the streets widen into a ceremonial route where footsteps feel louder, like you are walking inside a drum. Somewhere ahead, a temple door creaks, not fully opening, just enough to let out a thin ribbon of lamplight. You do not go in. You simply linger near the threshold of the idea that in this world, reality is layered. Under the visible city is an invisible city of duties, jurisdictions, and divine portfolios. And Enki and Enlil are not just brothers because a storyteller decided to add drama. They are brothers because the universe is being imagined as a household. A very intense household, the kind where one sibling labels the pantry shelves and the other sibling quietly rearranges them at night. Smiling, here is a mainstream historical fact that sits quietly but firmly. Sumerian religion was not one unified system across all cities. Each major city had its own patron deity and its own priesthood, and political shifts often nudged which gods became more central. That means the way Enlil and Enki are presented can change depending on who is telling the story and which city wants its god to look like the responsible adult. So when you hear Enlil is supreme in one tradition and Enki is crucial in another, it is not necessarily contradiction, it is competition, ancient, bureaucratic, and honestly, kind of relatable. You come to a place where the architecture feels more official. There are carved doorposts. There are lion motifs that stare past you as if you are late for a meeting. You can almost feel the concept of order in the symmetry of the stones. This is Enlil's vibe. Enlil is the one associated with Nippur, the city that becomes a major religious center, the kind of place where legitimacy is stamped like a seal. If you want your kingship to feel real, you want Nippur's blessing. You want Enlil's attention, preferably in a good mood. But even here, where air and authority reign, you cannot ignore the pull of the watery south, of Eridu, the place often tied to Enki, where the idea of the Abzu is not abstract. It is under you. It is beneath the foundations. It is the hidden freshwater source that makes life possible even when the surface looks like dust and salt. Enki's realm is not flashy. It is foundational. And that is why the conflict is not simply who is stronger. It is who is more necessary, which is the kind of argument siblings can keep alive for centuries. You walk as if you are moving between invisible signposts. This alley belongs to craft. That rooftop belongs to storm. That canal belongs to wisdom. That gust of wind belongs to decree. The gods are less like characters and more like systems. And you're now seeing how the system gets divided up. In some cosmologies, Enlil's domain is the space between heaven and earth, the air that separates and connects. He is the breath that carries commands. He is the storm that reminds everyone the sky has an opinion. Enki's domain is the deep, the watery below, the place where secrets and resources sit. And when you divide the cosmos that way, you get a division of duties that feels neat on paper and messy in practice, because nothing stays politely in its lane. Water evaporates. Wind stirs waves. The brothers' jurisdictions overlap like ink spreading on wet clay. And this is where the rivalry quietly sharpens. Because if you are Enlil and your job is order, you look at water and you think, slippery. If you are Enki and your job is clever survival, you look at wind and you think, unpredictable. Each brother, in his own way, can claim he is doing what must be done. Each can look at the other and think, yes, but you are making it harder for everyone. Historians still argue whether the harshness sometimes attributed to Enlil reflects an older mythic personality or later political theology, shaped by the rise of Nippur's influence. In other words, did Enlil become the strict one because that is who he always was? Or because certain priestly centers needed a strict divine administrator to match their earthly administration? It is the kind of debate that makes you imagine ancient priests politely insulting each other over dinner. Like, oh, your God is merciful. How adorable. You pass a courtyard where a group of men have fallen asleep on reed mats, their limbs flung out with that fearless trust only exhaustion can give you. One snores. Another mutters something that could be a prayer or could be a complaint about his back. And you think about how divine roles are not just theology. They filter down. A God of decree affects how people imagine justice. A God of cleverness affects how people imagine problem solving. The brother conflict is also a conflict over how humans should live. Strict adherence or adaptive thinking. Do as commanded or find a way. And yes, you can do both. But not everyone agrees on the ratio. A light joke slips in, gentle as a pillow, if Enlil runs the cosmic office. He is the one who sends the all-caps memo about proper sandal storage. Enki is the one who reads it, nods, and then invents a sandal rack that technically counts as proper storage, while also being a tiny rebellion. Nobody is harmed, but Enlil is still somehow irritated because rules were not meant to be interpreted like modern terms and conditions. You reach a small shrine where the offerings are simple. A cup of water, a bit of bread, maybe a figurine pressed from clay. The simplicity makes it feel intimate. You imagine a person here earlier, whispering not to a distant sky, but to the ground, to the unseen water beneath, asking Enki for help with a craft, a birth, a plan. Then you imagine another person, in another city, lifting hands to the wind, asking Enlil for the rain to come at the right time, for the storm to pass, for the king to remain stable, for the world to stay ordered. The cosmic division becomes emotional in your body. When you think of Enlil, you feel upright, shoulders squared, like you have to behave. When you think of Enki, you feel your spine loosen, like there is room to breathe, room to improvise. Neither feeling is wrong, but you can sense how one could resent the other. If you live by structure, improvisation looks like threat. If you live by improvisation, structure looks like a cage. Now, Here is a quirky tidbit that is not quite fringe, more like an odd angle you might miss. Some scholars note that myths can function like maps of competing institutions. If Enlil is tied to Nippur's temple authority and Enki to Eridu's traditions, then the brothers' conflict can reflect real-world rivalry between priesthoods, between regions, between northern and southern power centers. It is not that the myths are fake. It is that they are doing more than one job at once. They are both story and political weather report. You follow the ceremonial road until it meets an open space where the sky feels larger. The stars are sharper here, away from the clustered buildings, and you tilt your head up, imagining how the cosmos is being divided in the mind of a Sumerian storyteller. Heaven above, earth below, watery deep beneath, the air between, the rules that keep the layers from collapsing, the cleverness that keeps life from getting crushed under the rules. You feel the brothers taking their places, not as cartoon rivals, but as necessary tensions. Enlil taking a stance like a gate, Enki settling like a spring under stone. They are brothers because they belong to the same cosmic family. They are rivals because their duties overlap where life gets complicated. And as you stand there, you realize something soothing and slightly ominous at the same time. The conflict is not starting because someone is evil. It is starting because the world is hard to manage. Someone has to say no. Someone has to say yes. And those two someones happen to share blood. A pantheon and a long memory. The night wind brushes your cheek. Cool now. And the canal water nearby gives off a faint, earthy smell. Air and water, Enlil and Enki. You keep walking, because the next step is where their division of cosmic duties stops being theory and starts turning into the kind of argument that will reach all the way to humanity. You do not really notice when the road changes, but you feel it. The official symmetry fades and the city begins to smell more like wet rope and fish nets, like someone has been working with water all day and the evidence is still in the air. The stars remain the same, but the ground under your feet seems softer, as if the earth here remembers being riverbed. Somewhere, a frog decides to audition for most persistent sound in the universe, and you respect it, even if you would also like it to stop. You are drifting toward Enki's side of the family argument now, not because you are choosing him, but because you want to understand the style of his power. Enlil's authority feels like a decree carved into stone. Enki's influence feels like a plan whispered into a craftsman's ear while everyone else is asleep. You can almost imagine him leaning against a canal wall, sleeves rolled up, looking like the kind of person who always knows where the spare key is hidden. The mainstream historical fact you carry into this section is simple and sturdy. Ancient Mesopotamia depended on irrigation, canals, and careful water management. Cities rose and fell with their ability to control water, distribute it, and prevent salinization and flooding. So a deity associated with fresh water, wisdom, and the subterranean source of life is not an abstract idea. It is practically a public utility with a divine face. When people prayed to Enki, they were not just being poetic. They were talking to the logic of survival in a land where water is both gift and threat. You step alongside a canal that slides through the city like a dark ribbon. Even at night, you can see faint movement, small ripples where something slips below the surface. You smell algae and mud and that metallic tang that clings to wet stone. If you listen, you can hear the canal's private conversation, a low, continuous shush. And that sound, more than any hymn, explains why Enki gets associated with the deep, the Abzu, the sweet water beneath the world. Enki's cleverness is famous. It is not the I am smarter than everyone kind of cleverness. It is the I can make a door out of what you thought was a wall kind. In myths, he is often the one who invents, who organizes, who distributes the me, the divine decrees or powers that shape civilization. And yes, the concept of me is one of those things that makes your modern brain want to blink a few times. They are like cosmic job descriptions, the essences of crafts and institutions. Imagine the universe handing out skill cards, and Enki is the one with the binder. You pass a workshop where tools hang on the wall. The shapes are simple but effective. Bronze glints faintly in the lamplight. A carpenter's adze, a potter's wheel, woven baskets stacked in a corner. You can almost feel Enki's fingerprints in the idea that human hands can transform raw chaos into something usable. And that is the heart of his charm. He is not just water. He is water plus thought. Water with intention. A light joke, because you deserve one at this hour. If Enki were alive today, he would be the friend who fixes your phone by tapping it twice and then refuses to explain how he did it. He would just smile, say, "It's complicated," and walk away while you stare at the revived screen like it is witchcraft. Enlil would be the friend who says you should not have dropped it in the first place and sends you a link to a safety case. You keep moving and you notice the city's soft underbelly, the places where rules blur. A side alley where someone is quietly trading goods outside the official market hours. A doorway where a midwife slips in and out with practiced secrecy. A corner shrine tucked behind a wall, not grand enough for priestly processions, but important enough for someone's private fear. Enki's domain lives in these edges, not lawlessness. Exactly. More like the reality that life does not always wait for permission. Historians still argue whether Enki's benefactor of humanity image was consistent across the earliest layers of Sumerian tradition, or whether it became more emphasized in later retellings, especially when other gods took on harsher administrative roles. In other words, is Enki inherently the compassionate trickster, or did he become that in contrast to a growing cultural need for a clever savior figure? The debate is quiet, but fascinating, because it reminds you that myths evolve like living organisms. They adapt. You pause near a basin where water has been poured for ritual washing. The surface is smooth enough to reflect your face, but the reflection trembles when the wind moves. And you think about Enki's sweet water symbolism. Not salty sea water, not destructive flood water, but drinkable, life-giving water. In a landscape where salt can poison fields and drought can end a city's future, sweet water is a promise. Enki, in that sense, is the god of the possible. Now comes a quirky tidbit that feels like a sideways glance. Enki's name in Sumerian. Enki is often understood as Lord of the Earth, while in Akkadian tradition he is associated with Ea. The shifts in naming reflect linguistic and cultural transitions, and they also show how a god can travel through time wearing different outfits. Think of it like a celebrity changing stage names when the audience changes. Same core persona, slightly different branding. You start to feel the brother conflict more personally here, because Enki's approach naturally irritates a god like Enlil. Enlil's power relies on clarity, on boundaries, on the idea that a decree is a decree, not a suggestion. Enki's power relies on ambiguity, on hidden depths, on the idea that a decree might have unintended consequences, and that wisdom includes knowing when to bend. If Enlil is the one who draws the line, Enki is the one who notices the line was drawn on wet clay. You walk past a group of fishermen sleeping beside their nets, their hands still smelling of river. They have the kind of sleep that comes from physical work, heavy and immediate. You imagine them waking at dawn, hauling nets, bargaining, offering a portion to the temple. Their relationship to the divine is practical. They do not need theology to know that water can be generous one day and stingy the next. They might ask Enki for a good catch, But they also might curse the river under their breath if it ruins their plans. And somehow, in this worldview, both are allowed. The gods are not fragile. Another light joke slips in, because the canal is making you contemplative and you need balance. Enki is the kind of deity who would absolutely approve of you using a spoon as a screwdriver if it works. Enlil would file a complaint with the Cosmic Safety Committee. The spoon would be confiscated. You would be told to attend a mandatory training on proper tool use in a civilized society. You notice, too, that Enki's cleverness is not always gentle. Trickster figures can be double-edged. A loophole can save you, but it can also trap you. Wisdom can be used for healing or for manipulation. Enki's myths sometimes include moments that make you raise an eyebrow, like, "Okay, sir, that is a choice." And that is important because it keeps him humanly complex. Even as a god, his compassion is not syrupy. It is strategic. He wants life to continue. He wants civilization to function. He will do what he must, even if it means making a mess along the way. You come to a place where the canal splits, sending water down two different channels. The fork is quiet, but it feels symbolic. This is how the brothers' conflict will work. The same divine source feeding different directions. The same cosmic family splitting responsibility, then blaming each other when the flow is not perfect. You kneel at the canal edge, not in worship, but in curiosity. You dip your fingers into the water. It is colder than you expect. It smells clean enough, sweet enough, and you feel the simple relief your body always feels near water. Then a wind gust skims the surface and sends ripples racing away, breaking your reflection into fragments. Water and wind in one instant. Enki and Enlil never truly separate, always interfering with each other, and this is where you start to understand the deeper tension. Enki's gifts, his clever inventions, and his quiet rescues can look like undermining to Enlil. Because if Enki keeps solving problems by bending rules, then Enlil's rules start to look optional. And once rules look optional, the whole structure wobbles. Enlil's fear is not petty. It is structural. Meanwhile, Enki looks at Enlil's strictness and sees suffering that could be avoided with a bit of creativity. Enki's frustration is not childish. It is compassionate in its own sly way. You stand and let the night settle around you again. The frog is still performing. Bless it. The canal keeps moving. The city sleeps in pieces, and you walk on with Enki's watery cleverness clinging to you like cool mist, because soon the story will tilt toward Enlil again, and you will feel the other brother's weight, the stern wind that demands the world behave. You leave the canal's soft breath behind, and even though the water is never truly far in these cities, the air starts to feel different, drier, sharper, like it has edges you could cut yourself on if you move too carelessly. The streets rise slightly, and the buildings look more official again, less like workshops and more like places where people sit upright for no reason other than tradition. You can almost sense the shift in posture. Shoulders back, chin lifted, as if the city itself has remembered it is being watched by something that values discipline. The wind picks up, not violently, just enough to make hanging reed screens knock gently against door frames. Tap, tap, tap. It is a small sound, but it is persistent, like someone trying to remind you of rules you forgot existed. And you know without needing a priest to whisper it into your ear. You are entering Enlil's atmosphere. Enlil is not the kind of god who waits quietly in the background. Even when he is not doing anything in the story, you feel him as pressure, as expectation. In the mythology, he is often tied to command, to the divine assembly, to the kind of authority that decides what happens next. If Enki feels like hidden fresh water you discover by digging, Enlil feels like the open sky that already owns you. You walk toward a broad plaza where the stones are smoother from countless feet, and the air smells faintly of dust and burned offerings. This is the kind of space where decisions get announced, where priests chant not as private comfort, but as public theater. And in the way the lamps are arranged, in the strictness of the geometry, you feel a certain mind at work. Enlil's mind, if you dare imagine a god having a mind the way you do, not chaotic, not playful, decisive, mainstream historical fact, gently set down like a brick in your path. Nippur was one of the most important religious centers in ancient Sumer and later Mesopotamia, and Enlil was strongly associated with it. Kings from various city-states sought a legitimacy through Nippur's religious authority. So when myths elevate Enlil, it is not just cosmic drama. It mirrors how political legitimacy could be linked to his temple and priesthood. You can almost see the ancient equivalent of a ruler posting, "Blessed by Enlil." Like a verified badge, the wind lifts a bit of grit and sends it skimming across the plaza. You blink, your eyes water, and you think, yes, this is Enlil's style. He does not always speak through whispers or clever clues. Sometimes he speaks through the environment itself, through storm and breath and the invisible force that can fill your lungs or steal your roof. You pause beside a column where carved symbols catch the lamplight, and you imagine the concept of law here, not as a list of personal rights, but as cosmic order. The world is fragile. The rivers can flood. Crops can fail. Enemies can arrive. Disease can spread. So a deity who represents stability, the enforcement of boundaries, is not automatically a villain. He is a shield. Even if that shield sometimes hits you in the face when you stand too close. Historians still argue whether Enlil's reputation for severity reflects the earliest Sumerian traditions or is intensified by later literary emphasis, especially in texts that frame him as the supreme authority among the gods. Put another way, did Enlil start strict and stay strict, or did scribes, priests, and politics gradually turn him into the ultimate because I said so figure? It is hard to know, because myths are not audio recordings. They are memories pressed into clay, curated by human hands. You wander toward a smaller shrine where wind chimes made of thin metal plates clink softly. It is delicate, almost pretty, which is not the vibe people usually imagine for Enlil. And that is the first reminder that even the storm god has nuance. Wind can be terrifying, but it can also cool a sweating brow. It can carry seeds. It can clear smoke. Enlil's domain includes the gentle parts too, even if the myths sometimes spotlight the harsh ones. A light joke slips in, because you can feel Enlil's seriousness thickening the air. If Enlil ran a modern city, he would be the one who actually enforces the quiet hour sign. Like, yes, the sign has been there forever, but he would be the first cosmic manager to show up at 10:01 p.m. with a clipboard and a disappointed sigh. Enki would be the one who quietly hands you noise-canceling headphones and says, technically, that counts as quiet. You keep walking, and you notice something important. Enlil's authority is not only about punishment, it is also about defining roles. In a society where hierarchy is woven into everything, from family to temple to palace, a god who embodies hierarchy is central. Enlil is often portrayed as the one who separates, who assigns, who declares. He is the divider of heaven and earth in some traditions, the one whose actions allow the cosmos to be organized. That organizing impulse is powerful. It is also controlling, and control is where conflict starts, especially when your brother is a master of slipping between the bars. You look up and see clouds drifting faintly, thin as ash. You imagine the people here watching the sky constantly, reading it like a mood ring for the gods. A storm could mean blessing or disaster. It depends on timing, on intensity, on where the water ends up. So when Enlil is angry in a myth, it is not just emotional drama, it is existential. Anger is weather. You stop near a set of steps leading up to a temple platform. The stone is worn, each step shaped by generations, and you imagine pilgrims climbing here, offering prayers for stability, for the king to remain just, for enemies to stay away, for crops to come in, for the city walls to hold. Enlil becomes the god you appeal to when you want the world to stop wobbling. But here is the subtle bite. The same force that keeps chaos out can also keep mercy out. If Enlil's job is order, then disturbances are not just annoying, they are dangerous. Noise, rebellion, uncontrolled growth, even too much human activity can look like the first crack in a dam. So Enlil's harshness can come from fear. Not fear like a trembling child, but fear like a governor who knows one weak decision can unravel everything. And this is where Enki and Enlil begin to feel like philosophical opposites. Enlil looks at humanity and thinks in terms of balance, population, obedience, the maintenance of cosmic equilibrium. Enki looks at humanity and thinks in terms of potential, adaptability, clever survival. One brother sees a system that must be regulated. The other sees lives that can be improved. Both are right. Both are dangerous. Which is, frankly, the worst kind of family argument because you cannot solve it by proving one side wrong. A quirky tidbit slips in. The kind of detail that makes you smile in the dark. In some depictions and later interpretations, Enlil's name and function linked to the idea of Lord Wind or Lord of the Air. And you can almost picture ancient people explaining him with the same resigned tone you use for a stubborn co-worker. That's Enlil. He's in charge. Nobody knows why. He just is. You can hear it in the sigh of the reed screens tapping against the doorway. Like a cosmic reminder that authority does not always explain itself. You sit for a moment on the lowest step of the platform. The stone holds a bit of the day's heat, warming your palms. The wind cools your face, and you feel the strange comfort of structure. There is a reason people keep coming back to Enlil. When life is uncertain, a god who represents certainty can feel like relief, even if he is stern, even if he is not particularly interested in your personal feelings. Some people want a god who listens. Other people want a god who enforces. You stand again, because the story is pulling you onward. You can sense that the next thing to arrive is not a gentle philosophical discussion. It is humanity, the real spark, the moment when Enki's clever kindness and Enlil's strict order stop being abstract forces and become arguments about actual living, noisy, complicated people. The wind passes through the plaza one more time, firm and steady, as if Enlil is clearing his throat before speaking. And you, half sleepy, half curious, keep walking right into the space where the brothers will start disagreeing over what to do with the creatures who pray to them. Feed them, annoy them, and keep them forever busy. You feel it before you see it, the shift from gods as weather and principle to gods as managers with a new project dropped on their desk. The plaza falls behind you, the wind still tugging at your sleeves like Enlil is trying to steer your attention, and you follow a street that slopes toward the busier heart of the city, where even at night there is a low hum of life refusing to fully shut down. A bakery is already awake, because time is weird when you are feeding a city. The smell of warm bread slips through a doorway and wraps around you like a blanket you did not know you needed. A brewer's yard has vats covered with cloth, and the faint, sour sweetness of fermenting beer hangs in the air. A donkey snorts somewhere, offended by existence, All of it is so ordinary, so human, that it almost feels rude to call it sacred. But that is exactly the point. In Mesopotamian thought, the sacred is not floating above daily life. It is kneading dough. It is hauling water. It is counting jars. It is standing in line and pretending you are not annoyed. And then, quietly, like someone adding a new ingredient to a stew, humans arrive in the brothers' story, not as a sudden creation scene with fireworks, but as a growing reality the gods have to account for. The way a city grows, the way noise grows, the way needs multiply, the way you wake up one morning and realize your simple system is now a complicated system with opinions. Mainstream historical fact. Tucked into your pocket, early Mesopotamian cities were among the first large-scale urban societies. With organized labor, temple economies, and complex administration, that growth meant more people, more specialization, more hierarchy, and more pressure on institutions to manage resources and work. The temple was not only a religious space, it was an economic engine, storing grain, organizing labor, distributing rations. So when myths talk about humans working, serving, making offerings, it mirrors the real-world structure where human labor and temple authority were intertwined. You walk past a storehouse wall that still holds the day's warmth, and you imagine the temple accountants, the scribes pressing wedges into clay to record who gets what. Barley, oil, wool, beer. Humans are listed like entries, not because they are unloved, but because the system is big enough that feelings do not keep it running. And that is where the brothers begin to disagree. Because a system this big needs both order and flexibility, and those two qualities rarely shake hands politely. Enlil looks at humanity and sees the necessity of regulation. People are many. People are loud. People want things. If left unchecked, people can turn a stable world into a shouting match with a side of famine. Enlil's instinct is to set boundaries, assign roles, define limits, make sure the cosmic balance does not tilt. He is the type of brother who sees a crowded room and immediately starts counting heads, checking exits, and muttering about capacity limits. Enki looks at humanity and sees potential. People are clever. People can learn. People can solve problems if given tools. Enki's instinct is to teach, to gift, to improve. He is the type of brother who sees the same crowded room and starts rearranging furniture so everyone fits. Then shows someone how to build a better chair. And the argument begins right there, in the difference between control the variable and empower the variable. You pass a courtyard where a family is sleeping close together on a roof because the night air is cooler up there. A baby fusses, then quiets. A mother's hand pats without waking fully, muscle memory doing its job. You glance up and think, yes, these are the beings the gods are debating. Not abstract mankind, actual bodies, actual hunger, actual little coughs in the dark. It is oddly intimate to realize the cosmic conflict is about this, about whether these small lives are treated as a burden or as an investment. Historians still argue whether some creation narratives and purpose of humans, themes, were primarily theological ideas or reflections of evolving socio-economic realities, especially as temple institutions expanded. In other words, did people invent myths about humans working for gods because that is what they believe spiritually? Or because the temple economy needed a cosmic justification for organized labor? It can be both. It is often both. Humans are excellent at building meaning and management into the same structure. A light joke slips in, because you can feel the tension thickening and you deserve a little air. If the gods have a group project, humanity is the part where someone says, "This will be easy." And then 3 days later, everyone is up at midnight, stress-eating dates, and arguing about whose job it was to bring the clay. Enlil is absolutely the one checking the rubric. Enki is absolutely the one adding extra features nobody asked for. Because it'll be better this way. You reach the edge of a market lane where stalls are shuttered, but the leftovers of trade still linger. The smell of spices ground into the dirt. The faint tang of copper, a broken reed basket, a spilled handful of grains that mice will celebrate later like it is a festival. You can practically see how humans complicate divine plans. Each person is a moving desire, a request, a problem, a solution, a surprise, and then you remember the tone of the myths. Humans are often portrayed as created to relieve the gods of work, to take on labor so the divine can rest. That idea sounds harsh if you hear it with modern ears, as if people are just tools. But inside the ancient worldview, it also implies humans are integrated into cosmic order. They matter because their work keeps the system functioning. Their offerings feed the gods. Their rituals maintain balance. It is not love in a modern romantic sense. It is relationship in a contractual sense, a sacred economy. Enlil tends to protect that economy by enforcing. Enki tends to protect it by innovating. You imagine a divine council, not as a thunderous marvel scene, but as a tired meeting where everyone has the same argument in different words. Enlil is saying, "We need limits." Enki is saying, "We need solutions." The other gods are saying, "Can we please just agree before dawn?" And someone, somewhere, is definitely doodling in the margins of the cosmic tablet. A quirky tidbit drifts in, soft and strange in some later interpretive traditions and modern fringe retellings. Enki's role as giver of knowledge gets compared to forbidden wisdom myths in other cultures, as if he is always the one slipping humans the secret password to reality. It is not a direct ancient equation, but it shows how people across time keep spotting the same archetype, the helpful rule bender, the one who hands you the manual the authority figure wanted locked away. Whether you see that as heroic or suspicious depends entirely on which brother's mood you are in. You keep walking, and the city seems to whisper the brothers' personalities into your senses. The wind pushes a loose reed mat against a wall, insisting it lie flat and behave. Enlil, the canal water, somewhere unseen, continues to move around obstacles without complaint. Enki. Two approaches. One world, another light joke. Because you are wandering through ancient streets at night and your brain deserves a treat. If Enlil is the terms of service, Enki is the FAQ. Enlil is what you technically agreed to. Enki is how you actually survive using the product. But the humor fades into something sharper when you think about scale. Humans are not a few families anymore. They are a population. Populations make noise. Populations make demands. Populations also make mistakes that ripple outward. The brothers' disagreement becomes urgent because it is no longer about cosmic aesthetics. It is about management of a living, multiplying species. You pause and listen. There is distant laughter from a rooftop. Someone still awake, telling a story. There is the soft clink of a jar being moved. There is a dog barking once, then deciding it is too tired to commit. It is not loud, not really. But imagine thousands of nights, thousands of rooftops, thousands of voices, every day more. In a mythic mind, that can start to feel like the world itself is getting noisier, harder to keep in balance. Enlil's instinct tightens. Boundaries, limits, consequences. Enki's instinct widens. Tools, guidance, workarounds. You realize the brothers are not arguing about whether humans should exist. They are arguing about what kind of existence humans should have. A controlled existence, carefully managed, or a resilient existence, supported by wisdom. And because they are brothers, neither wants to admit the other might be partly right. Because admitting your sibling is partly right is basically the hardest spiritual practice known to any universe. You walk back into the deeper night, and the city seems to hold its breath, like it senses what is coming next. Because once humans are on the board, the next argument writes itself. Humans are noisy. Humans are restless. Humans are complicated. And sooner or later, someone in the divine household is going to say, "Enough," and someone else is going to whisper, "Not like that." The brother conflict has found its true fuel, not ego, not a simple power struggle, but the messy, living reality of you, of humanity, of all these sleeping rooftops and warm bread smells and restless dreams. You keep walking as the night deepens, and now the city feels like a creature breathing in its sleep. Roofs rise and fall like ribs. Smoke thins, lamps dim. Somewhere, a drunk man sings to the moon with the confidence of someone who has never heard himself recorded. The song is off-key, but it is passionate, and you can almost feel the gods collectively squinting at it from wherever gods squint from. This is where the problem becomes a phrase that sounds almost funny until you imagine it as a cosmic complaint filed in triplicate. Humans are too noisy. Not noisy like, "Oh no, the neighbors have a party." Noisy like the whole species is vibrating the order of the world. In some traditions, the gods become irritated by humanity's clamor, their constant activity, their endless needs and prayers and work and births and arguments and, yes, singing. And the brothers, Enlil and Enki, do not respond the same way to that irritation. You pause beside a narrow lane where the walls trap sound, and you hear a muffled argument from behind a door. A couple whisper fighting, trying not to wake the household, but failing in that way humans fail. Because the whisper contains all the sharpness of full volume, it is intimate and ordinary, and it makes the myth feel suddenly believable. If you can get annoyed by a whispered argument at 2 imagine being a god trying to maintain cosmic order while an entire civilization is doing that endlessly. Mainstream historical fact, offered softly. Flood traditions and divine displeasure narratives are widespread in Mesopotamian literature, and one of the famous compositions, the Atrahasis epic, includes a theme where the gods are disturbed by humanity's growing noise and decide to reduce the population. This is not a late internet invention. It is in the ancient literary record. And it is one of those moments where you realize the ancients were perfectly capable of writing stories that feel like a dark parody of governance. Now, you are not going to get a hypey, shouted version of this tonight. We are doing it softly, because even the terrifying parts in these myths have a strange, sleepy inevitability to them, like a storm forming far away, while you lie in bed and pretend you cannot hear the thunder. Enlil is the brother whose patience runs out first, at least in the way the story is often told. Enlil hears the noise and does not interpret it as life. He interprets it as imbalance, a system that will collapse if not corrected. He is the cosmic authority figure who believes in consequences, and not the gentle, learn your lesson kind. The, we have tried nothing, and we are all out of patience kind. In his worldview, the universe is not a playground. It is a structure. If the structure is vibrating too hard, you reinforce it, or you remove the vibration. Enki hears the noise and interprets it differently. He understands the problem because he is not naive. He knows uncontrolled growth and endless demand can break a system, but he is also the one who tends to look for solutions that preserve life. He thinks in terms of adjustments, not annihilation. He is the brother who suggests turning the volume down instead of smashing the instrument. Historians still argue whether the noise motif should be read literally, as a mythic explanation for population pressure and resource strain, or symbolically, as a metaphor for human independence and the disruption of divine hierarchy. In other words, are humans noisy because there are too many of them? Or because they're acting too much like they have agency? Or is it both, because myths love multitasking? You walk under a balcony where someone has hung drying herbs, and the wind stirs them, releasing a faint medicinal scent. It makes you think of another part of these stories, the attempts to solve the noise problem through plagues, droughts, famine, not because the gods are randomly cruel, but because the narrative is exploring control measures, like a dark experiment in management. And if you are feeling uncomfortable, good. Not in an anxious way. In a this is real human storytelling about power way. Because this is the brother conflict at its sharpest. Enlil's solution is reduction. Enki's solution is mitigation. A light joke tiptoes in. Because you need a little cushion, Enlil is the kind of being who would mute the entire group chat because one person keeps sending voice notes. Enki is the one who DMs you like, "Hey, I found a workaround, just turn notifications off instead." Enlil would respond, "No, silence means silence." Enki would respond, "Okay, but have you tried settings? You keep moving, and the city's quiet becomes more intense, like even the bricks are listening. You imagine the divine council again, and it feels less like a meeting and more like a courtroom. Enlil stands as prosecutor. Humanity is disruptive. Humanity is multiplying. Humanity threatens balance. Enki stands as defense. Humanity is valuable. Humanity can adapt. Humanity can be guided. And somewhere in the back row of the cosmic courtroom, a lesser god is definitely yawning because this case has been going on for centuries. Here is the part that makes the myth feel almost eerily modern. Enlil is not portrayed as evil for wanting stability. Stability is genuinely important. A society can collapse under strain, but the methods matter. And Enlil's methods can be blunt. He is wind and decree. His tools are pressure and force. Enki's methods are subtle. He is water and wisdom. His tools are suggestion and trickery. He will sometimes speak in riddles or indirect warnings, because he cannot openly oppose the decree without risking cosmic rebellion. This is where the conflict becomes a dance of power, not just disagreement. Enki cannot always say no to Enlil outright, so he says yes, while quietly creating an escape hatch. A quirky tidbit. Soft but strange. Some scholars have noted that in these narratives, Enki's interventions can resemble the role of a culture hero who preserves humanity through cleverness, which may have made him especially beloved in communities that depended on practical knowledge, like irrigation specialists, craftsmen, and scribes. The idea is not that everyone sat around thinking, "I love loopholes," but that a god who embodies problem-solving feels emotionally supportive in a world of unpredictable hardship. When your crops fail, you do not just want punishment explained. You want a plan. You stop near a courtyard where a small shrine holds a lamp burning low. The flame is tiny, stubborn, refusing to go out. It makes you think of humanity in these stories, persistent and bothersome and alive. You think of Enlil wanting to blow that flame out to protect the house from fire. You think of Enki wanting to shield it with his hands, so it keeps burning without burning everything down. Another light joke, because the lamp is dramatic and you're allowed to smile. Humanity is basically that one candle that keeps flickering even after you swear you blew it out. Enlil is offended. Enki is impressed. The candle is just doing candle things. You begin to feel the next turn coming, the one everyone half remembers, the flood shadows. But tonight we are not rushing there like a trailer voice shouting, and then everything changed. No, we are walking there like you walk toward thunder, slow, aware, listening, because before the flood story becomes a flood story, it is a brother story. Enlil is tightening the rules, because he believes the world is slipping. Enki is preparing workarounds, because he believes life is worth the trouble. And the noise problem is the excuse, the mythic language for a deeper anxiety. What happens when humans become too many, too loud, too independent for the system that created them? You stand for a moment, letting the wind brush your hair and the distant canal murmur behind walls. Wind and water again, always together, even when they pretend they are separate. You feel the brothers' disagreement sharpening into action. You can practically hear Enlil's decree forming like a gust. You can practically sense Enki's mind turning like water seeking a crack. And you keep walking into the darker part of the night, where the stories stop being only about rules and cleverness, and start becoming about survival. You do not see the flood yet, not as water rising, not as boats, not as anything dramatic. What you feel first is the mood of it, the way a city gets tense before weather, the way people become quieter without deciding to. Even the dog that was judging you earlier seems to have gone home to sleep properly, which is honestly the most responsible thing anyone does in these myths. The night air is thick with the possibility of storm. Somewhere far off, thunder rolls so softly it could be a heavy cart crossing a bridge. You keep walking, and your mind keeps replaying that phrase, the noise problem, because now it is not just a complaint. It is a justification, a reason to act. And Enlil, the god of decree and wind, is not the kind of being who writes a justification and then forgets to follow through. So the flood shadows come in the way shadows always come, not as a single moment, but as a gradual darkening. Mainstream historical fact, steady and quiet. Mesopotamian literature preserves multiple flood traditions, including a version in the Atrahasis epic and another in the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, which itself draws on earlier sources. These stories share motifs with each other and with later flood narratives in other traditions, though the details differ. This is not a one-off tale. It is a recurring pattern in the region's storytelling, suggesting a deep cultural memory of catastrophic flooding, or at least of floods as a powerful metaphor for reset. You stop near a canal gate, one of those wooden and reed structures used to control water flow. It creaks when the wind shifts. You look at it and think, yes, flood is never just water. Flood is the loss of control. Flood is the canal gate failing. Flood is the line between gift and disaster dissolving. In this world, a flood story hits close to home. You cannot listen to it like a fairy tale when you have watched river levels rise and wondered if your house will still be there tomorrow. Enlil's role in these traditions often feels like the one who approves or initiates the destructive measure, not because he is twirling a villain mustache, but because he is enforcing cosmic limits. From his perspective, humanity is destabilizing the world. The decree to wipe them out, or drastically reduce them, becomes a kind of harsh correction. If the structure is shaking, you remove the load. Brutal, yes. But in the logic of a strict administrator, it is logical. Enki's role is where the story gets its heartbeat. He does not simply shout no and win. He cannot. Enlil's authority in the divine hierarchy is too heavy for that. So Enki does what he does best. He bends. He slips through cracks. He finds a loophole so narrow it barely counts as a path. And then he walks through it anyway. carrying life on his shoulders like it is a secret he refuses to surrender. Historians still argue whether Enki's warning or rescue role in these flood narratives reflects an older theological emphasis on his wisdom and protective qualities, or a later narrative need to create tension between divine justice and divine mercy. In other words, did the tradition always want a compassionate trickster to counterbalance harsh decree? Or did that counterbalance grow stronger as storytellers wrestled with the morality of mass destruction? You can feel the human hand in the question. Humans do not just tell disaster stories. They argue with them. You keep walking and the city seems to thin, as if you are leaving the safe, familiar lanes and stepping into a more mythic landscape where symbols get louder. The canal water beside you looks darker now. The surface is calm, but you can imagine it swelling. You can imagine it turning from a quiet ribbon into a broad, hungry sheet. Your throat tightens just thinking about it. Because even in a bedtime voice, your body knows what drowning is. And no, we are not doing gore tonight. We are doing dread. Clean, simple dread. The quirky tidbit arrives in a hush. In some versions of the flood tradition, Enki cannot directly tell the human hero the plan. So he speaks to a wall or a reed hut, letting the warning be overheard. It is such a specific detail that it feels like a little wink from the ancient storyteller. Like, see, he didn't technically break the rule. He just talked very loudly at architecture. Enki, patron saint of plausible deniability. You almost smile, because it is ridiculous. A god addressing a wall. But then you imagine the stakes. Enki is trying to save a thread of humanity without openly defying Enlil. It is clever. It is also heartbreaking. The god who loves loopholes is using one to protect lives from his own brother's decree. You picture the human figure who receives the warning, often called Etrahasis in one tradition, Utnapishtim in another, not a superhero, not a chosen one with glowing eyes, but a person who listens, who builds, who obeys instructions with the trembling focus of someone who knows the sky might be about to fall into the river. The boat becomes a symbol of Enki's kind of wisdom, practical, constructed, made of materials you can touch. Not a magical portal, a vessel, a plan made of wood, pitch, rope, and desperate patience. A light joke slips in, because your nerves like to be held gently. Imagine being told by a god, through your wall, to build a boat because a cosmic committee is about to rage quit humanity. You would be like, okay, sure. And then immediately realize you have to find lumber in a place where trees are not exactly everywhere. Enki is giving life-saving instructions, and you are there like, fantastic. Where do I buy? A forest? You keep walking, and you hear the wind again, firmer now, as if Enlil is pacing. Wind has that personality. It does not just exist, it arrives. It insists. It pushes dust. It pushes doors. It pushes your thoughts. Enlil's force is not subtle. If he has decided the world needs correction, the correction will come like weather. Enki's force is subtle. He is the quiet hand on the latch, the whispered instruction, the hidden spring. In the flood story, their conflict becomes vivid because their methods are visible. Enlil is the flood. Enki is the boat. One is destruction framed as order. The other is survival framed as clever mercy. You stand beneath an awning and watch a few drops fall. Not yet a storm, just the sky testing itself. The scent of dust and rain rises. Petrichor. Even if nobody has a word for it yet, your skin prickles, and you imagine the city's people asleep, unaware of the cosmic argument unfolding above their roofs. That is the cruelest part of divine drama. The ones affected are not in the room, Another light joke. Because you are getting too tense. If the gods had a customer support line, humanity would be on hold forever, listening to a loop of flute music, while Enlil says, "Please refer to the decree." And Enki whispers, "Press 2 for secret options." You keep the tone soft, but you let the weight land. The flood is a mythic reset button, a terrifying expression of the idea that the world can be wiped clean when it becomes too messy. And the brothers' conflict is right in the center of it, because Enlil represents the willingness to reset for the sake of order, while Enki represents the refusal to let life be erased without at least trying to preserve a seed. You take a slow breath and listen to the canal again. It is still calm. The city still sleeps. But the story has shifted. We are no longer discussing philosophy. We are watching consequences. Enlil's decree has teeth. Enki's mercy has strategy. And as you continue walking through the night, you can feel the next question forming, the one that makes the flood story more than a disaster tale. What happens after? When the waters recede? When the boat rests? When the survivors step out into a changed world? How do the brothers face each other again? Does Enlil regret? Does Enki boast? Do they negotiate new rules? The thunder rolls again, softer now, like a distant drum. You keep moving toward dawn that is still far away, letting the flood shadows stay in your peripheral vision, because the real conflict is not the water. It is the relationship. The uneasy balance between stern decree and clever compassion, between a brother who would cleanse the world and a brother who would save a handful of lives by speaking to a wall. You keep walking, and it feels like the air itself is changing temperature. Not because the flood has happened in front of you, but because the story has crossed a threshold. After a disaster, even a mythic one, the world never snaps back to normal. It limps, it renegotiates. It becomes tense in that quiet way people get tense after an argument when nobody wants to bring it up. But everyone is thinking about it anyway. You step into a part of the city where you can see the palace walls in silhouette, darker than the night, and the temple complex rising nearby like a second, older palace. Here is where the brothers' conflict becomes something humans can touch directly. Because Enki and Enlil do not just argue in the sky. Their rivalry becomes a kind of currency that kings spend, that cities gamble with, that priesthoods leverage like a pressure point. Mainstream historical fact. Slipped in like a careful stamp on clay, Mesopotamian kingship was deeply tied to divine favor. Rulers often presented themselves as chosen, supported, or legitimated by particular gods, and major temple centers played a role in that legitimacy. In inscriptions and hymns, kings name-drop deities the way modern politicians name institutions, because association equals authority. If you can say, "The god supports me," you're not just being pious. You are making a political claim. You move along the palace perimeter and see guards sleeping in shifts, spears leaning against the wall, eyes half closed, bodies trained to wake fast. The palace is not just a home. It is a machine. It collects taxes, organizes labor, directs warfare, negotiates alliances. And just like any machine, it needs a story to justify why it is allowed to exist. That story often comes from the gods. Now imagine the brothers as two different stamps a king can press into his legitimacy. Enlil's stamp says lawful authority, sanctioned order, cosmic approval. Enki's stamp says wisdom, cunning, prosperity, the clever guidance that makes a city flourish. Both are tempting, both are useful. And if you are a ruler, you do not necessarily want only one. You want the authority of Enlil and the ingenuity of Enki, like having both a badge and a toolbox. But the problem is, gods are not neutral. Gods have histories. Priesthoods have rivalries. Cities have loyalties. So when a king leans toward Enlil's temple, he's also leaning toward the institutions that claim Enlil's voice. When a king leans toward Enki's tradition, he is aligning with a different network of expertise and influence. The brother conflict becomes a map of politics. Historians still argue how directly myths reflect political realities versus shaping them, and it is a chicken and egg kind of debate. Did kings and priesthoods use the Enlil-Enki rivalry because it already existed in popular belief? Or did the rivalry become more pronounced because it was useful in the power struggles between cities and temples? Probably both. Human storytelling and human ambition are basically best friends who pretend they do not know each other. You step into a temple courtyard where a statue base sits in shadow, the figure above it barely visible. You imagine the rituals that happen here, the offerings, the hymns, the public processions. Religion is not private therapy in this world. It is civic infrastructure. When the priest speaks, the city listens. Because what the priest says affects how people understand drought, disease, victory, defeat, and the right to rule. And here is the subtle way Enki and Enlil's personalities become tools. Enlil's sternness can be framed as justice. A king aligned with Enlil can present himself as the enforcer of order, the one who punishes rebellion, the one who protects the cosmic balance. Enki's cleverness can be framed as benevolence. A king aligned with Enki can present himself as the bringer of prosperity, the one who improves irrigation, supports crafts, encourages knowledge. Both images are powerful. Both can be used sincerely or cynically. Light joke. Because your brain is imagining ancient propaganda posters now. If this were modern PR, Enlil's campaign slogan would be law, order, wind. Enki's would be innovation, water, solutions. And the king would be like, why not both? While quietly making sure his face is carved slightly larger than everyone else's on the monument. You walk past a row of storage jars sealed with clay stoppers. These jars hold grain, oil, beer. They are the lifeblood of the city. Control of stored resources is control of stability, and temple complexes often controlled large amounts of these goods, distributing rations to workers, funding building projects, supporting priests, scribes, and laborers. So when you think of divine favor, do not picture only spiritual glow. Picture who gets fed. Picture who gets work. Picture whose family survives a bad harvest. Enlil's sphere, through major religious centers like Nippur, can become associated with legitimacy at the highest level. Enki's sphere, tied to wisdom and water, can become associated with the practical prosperity that keeps people calm enough to accept legitimacy. When the brothers clash, humans feel it in taxes, in rituals, in the way a new king frames his story. The quirky tidbit in this section comes like a little crooked smile from the scribes. Some myths and hymns can function like subtle advertising for a city's patron god, praising their power, their mercy, their supremacy. It is not that the ancient writers were lying. It is that they were participating in a cultural ecosystem where praising your god was praising your city. So when you read a text that makes Enlil seem like the absolute boss, or Enki seem like the indispensable genius, you may be hearing the echo of a particular temple's influence, ancient brand loyalty, but with incense. You reach the edge of the palace courtyard where a low wall overlooks the city. From here, rooftops spread out like a patchwork of sleeping squares. You can see faint smoke rising from a few chimneys. The canal glints in the moonlight. It is peaceful from above, which is always suspicious, because peace usually means someone is working very hard to maintain it. You imagine a king standing here, listening to advisors. One says, "We must honor Enlil with a grand offering, or our rule will not be recognized." another says. We must invest in canals and crafts and honor Enki, or our people will starve and revolt. The king nods, pretending both are equally important, while secretly worrying about the next war, the next drought, the next rumor. The gods are not just divine, they are strategies. Historians still argue whether the prominence of Enlil in political legitimation was consistent across all periods or shifted with empire, conquest, and changing theological trends. And you can feel why it matters. Because if Enlil's stamp becomes the gold standard, then Enki's role might shift toward advisor rather than ruler. If Enki's wisdom becomes central, Enlil's decrees might be portrayed as too harsh, too rigid. The brothers' conflict is not frozen in time. It evolves with who holds power. Another light joke. Because your head is full of ancient politics and you need to breathe. Imagine being a royal advisor trying to explain to a king why he needs to donate a mountain of barley to a temple for cosmic balance. While the king is like, cosmic balance is great, but I also need my army not to quit. Enki would be in the background suggesting a spreadsheet. Enlil would demand the donation in the proper ceremonial font. You step down from the wall and continue through the quiet streets, and you begin to sense how the brothers' conflict trickles into daily loyalties. A household might favor Enki because their livelihood depends on water management and craft. Another might favor Enlil because they want protection, law, stability. And most people, realistically, would honor both. Because when you live in a harsh environment, you do not put all your prayers in one basket. You diversify your divine portfolio. Ancient risk management. But the rivalry still matters, because when crisis hits, people look for someone to blame. If a flood destroys crops, was it Enlil's stormy anger? If a canal fails, did Enki withdraw his support? If a king loses a battle, did he offend Enlil by neglecting Nippur? Or did he lack Enki's wisdom in planning? The brothers become interpretive lenses through which the city makes sense of pain. You feel the story leaning forward again, because politics is not the end point. It is the stage. The next movement will bring the conflict into deeper philosophical territory, where the brothers' opposition becomes not just which temple wins, but what kind of world should exist, and what kind of humans should thrive in it. The palace fades behind you. The canal's scent returns faintly. The wind touches your cheek again. You realize you are walking inside a living argument that has been going on for generations. An argument that kings exploit, priests interpret, and ordinary people feel in their bones when the sky changes and the river rises. And you keep walking, because the next step is where the rivalry stops looking like politics and starts looking like worldview. You keep moving through the city's quiet arteries, and it starts to feel like you are traveling between two invisible poles. One pulls like wind, the other pulls like water. You can almost chart it in your body. When you think of Enlil, your chest lifts, your spine straightens, your breath becomes shallow and alert. When you think of Enki, your shoulders drop, your breath deepens, your thoughts loosen like knots soaking in warm water. It is strange how myth can become physical. You are not just learning about gods, you are learning about temperaments. And now the story takes you out of the lane-by-lane intimacy and into something broader. Sacred geography. Because in Mesopotamia, holy places are not interchangeable. They are anchors. They shape which God feels like the center of the universe. And that is where Nippur and Eridu begin to feel like more than dots on a map. They become moods. They become arguments made of bricks and ritual. Mainstream historical fact, laid down gently, Nippur, associated strongly with Enlil, was a major religious center, while Eridu, often linked with Enki, is among the earliest urban sites in southern Mesopotamia and held deep religious significance in Sumerian tradition. Different cities elevated different deities, and the prominence of temples could influence how myths were told and which gods were emphasized. Geography and theology braided together like reeds. You imagine yourself traveling, not in a modern car with music playing, but on foot or by boat, moving along canals that glimmer under the sun and then under stars, passing date palms, mud flats, fields stitched with irrigation ditches. Each stop has its own smell. One town smells like fish and salt. Another smells like sheep and smoke. Another smells like fresh clay and kiln heat. And with each stop, the gods shift in prominence. The way someone's face changes when you step into their house versus someone else's house. You feel Nippur first, even in imagination, a city that carries weight. The air feels drier there, the sky bigger, the wind more noticeable, as if the atmosphere itself is paying respect. You picture the Temple of Enlil, the place where kings want their rule recognized, where decrees feel like they have divine backing. Nippur is like a stamp on a document. Without it, you might still be king, but you are the kind of king people question when they are bored. Then you feel Eridu, farther south, closer to the idea of ancient marshes and watery depths, a place where the ground remembers water, where the concept of the Abzu makes emotional sense. Eridu is quieter in a different way. Not quiet like enforced silence, but quiet like deep water. You picture Enki there, not perched above, but rooted below, in hidden springs and in the craftsman's careful hands. The brothers' conflict becomes almost inevitable when you picture these two centers. Because if you are a priest in Nippur, your job is to keep Enlil central. The cosmos needs an administrator, the world needs rules. The king needs legitimacy. Enlil is the solution, and if you are a priest in Eridu, your job is to keep Enki central. Life needs water. Civilization needs wisdom. People need skills, healing, and guidance. Enki is the solution. Two solutions. Two centers, one world. Historians still argue how much intercity competition shaped mythic emphasis, and whether certain texts were composed or copied in ways that promoted one center's theological prestige. This is not conspiracy. It is culture. People naturally elevate what is important to them. If your city thrives because of canal work and craft, you will sing loudly about the god who embodies those things. If your city thrives because of political recognition and religious authority, you will sing loudly about the god who embodies that. You pause near a small roadside shrine in your mind's journey, and you imagine travelers leaving offerings there, little bits of bread or a splash of beer, because travel is dangerous and you do not tempt fate by being stingy with the gods. The traveler might pray to Enlil for protection from storms and bandits. The same traveler might pray to Enki for safe water crossings and clever solutions to problems on the road. The geography of worship is practical. It is also emotional. You honor the god who feels close to your danger. A light joke slips in. Because you are picturing ancient travelers and you need a small smile, imagine stopping at a shrine and being like, "Dear Enlil, please no sandstorms," and then immediately turning to Enki like, "And if there is a sandstorm, please give me the brilliant idea to hide behind the donkey." Divine customer service, but you are hedging your bets like a pro. You begin to see how the brothers' rivalry is reinforced by place itself, wind and water, north and south, legitimacy and ingenuity, and the sacred geography becomes a kind of emotional map for the people living in it. If you live under Enlil's shadow, you might internalize the idea that stability matters most. If you live under Enki's influence, you might internalize the idea that clever adaptability matters most. Two different moral centers. The quirky tidbit comes drifting in like a faint, marshy scent. In Sumerian king lists and certain traditions, Eridu is sometimes portrayed as one of the earliest seats of kingship, almost mythically ancient. That gives Enki's city a kind of first-light prestige, even if later political power shifts elsewhere. It is the kind of detail that lets Eridu whisper, "We were here first," which is basically the oldest sibling argument in history. Except in this case, the siblings are whole cities. You keep walking, and you notice how the temples themselves act like magnets. People bring offerings. Offerings become wealth. Wealth becomes building projects. Building projects become jobs. Jobs attract people. People expand the city. The city increases the temple's influence. It is a feedback loop, and inside that loop, myths grow, hymns get composed, stories get copied, gods get praised, rivalries get sharpened. Another light joke. Because the idea of temple economics can feel heavy. Temples are basically ancient multi-purpose centers. Worship, storage, administration, education, and probably a lot of gossip. If you think your community center is busy, imagine one where the gods are literally on the payroll. You begin to feel the brothers' conflict shifting again, from political use to philosophical essence. Because geography is not just about where, it is about identity. When you say Nippur, you're saying authority. When you say Eridu, you're saying wisdom. So when Enlil and Enki argue, the argument carries the weight of entire regions and their ways of living. Historians still argue whether Enlil's dominance in certain periods reflects a genuinely widespread theological consensus, or kind of official ideology driven by powerful centers. Meanwhile, Enki's enduring popularity suggests that practical, personal devotion can resist official hierarchies. People can respect Enlil's authority and still whisper to Enki for help. The official and the personal, the decree and the workaround. You picture a scribe copying a hymn in Nippur, careful and reverent, making sure Enlil's titles are properly grand. You picture another scribe in the south, copying a tale where Enki outsmarts a crisis with cleverness. Both scribes believe they are preserving truth. Both are also preserving their world's priorities. And now the story wants to move from places to ideas. Because once you understand that the brothers are rooted in different sacred landscapes, you are ready to feel the deeper split. Enki has trickster wisdom, Enlil has moral order. Not moral in the modern, be nice sense, but moral in the system must remain balanced sense. That split is where the conflict becomes philosophical, not just geographic. The wind brushes you again, and you imagine Nippur's open air. The canal's scent returns, and you imagine Eridu's watery depth. You are walking between them, carrying both in your breath, and you realize the brothers are not truly separate forces. They are two ways of surviving the same harsh land. Two different answers to the same question. How do you keep a fragile world from breaking? You keep walking. And the next step is where those answers become values, and the values become the kind of argument that never fully ends. You keep moving, and the city around you feels less like a set of buildings now and more like a living mind, full of competing impulses. A gust of wind presses against a doorway and makes it groan. A trickle of water slips through a crack in a canal wall and finds its own path. You do not need a priest to interpret this. Your body already understands it. One force commands, one force adapts. And tonight, you're walking right through the seam where those forces argue. By now, you can feel the rivalry is not only about which temple is bigger or which city has prestige. It is about what kind of wisdom counts as wisdom. Enlil's wisdom looks like order, clarity, consequence. Enki's wisdom looks like flexibility, invention, mercy with a wink. One is moral order, one is trickster intelligence, and if you have ever argued with someone who thinks rules are the point, while you think outcomes are the point, you have basically reenacted this myth in your kitchen. Mainstream historical fact, placed softly in your hands. Mesopotamian texts include many wisdom traditions and instructional writings, and in mythic narratives, gods can embody social ideals, like kingship, justice, craft, and knowledge. These stories were copied and taught by scribes over centuries, meaning they functioned as cultural memory and as a kind of education. When Enlil and Enki are portrayed in certain ways, it is not random entertainment. It is society thinking out loud about what it values. You walk past a schoolhouse where the door's shut, but you can almost hear the echo of a teacher's reed stylus tapping, the sound that says, again, neater. Scribes learn by repetition. Culture learns by repetition too. So the story repeats a pattern. Enlil lays down a rule. Enki finds a way around it. Enlil enforces order. Enki protects life. Enlil fears chaos. Enki fears cruelty. And humans, listening, learn what tensions they must live with. You stop in a narrow alley where the wind cannot fully enter. And it is suddenly warmer, quieter, more intimate. Enki's kind of wisdom thrives here. The kind you use when you cannot change the whole world, but you can change your situation. The kind you use when the law's too rigid and you need to survive anyway. Enki is not anti-order. He is anti-pointless suffering. He is the voice that says, if the rule kills the patient, maybe adjust the rule. Enlil's kind of wisdom thrives in open spaces, in plazas, in courts, in temples where everything is visible. The kind you use when you are responsible for more than yourself. The kind you use when you know that one small exception can become 1,000. Enlil is not anti-mercy. He is anti-collapse. He is the voice that says, if you keep making exceptions, the system stops being a system. Historians still argue whether trickster figures in Mesopotamian myth should be seen primarily as humorous disruptions or as serious vehicles for social critique, reflecting anxieties about power and justice. In other words, is Enki's rule-bending meant to be laughed at, or is it meant to be admired as a necessary check on authority? The answer is likely both. Because humor is one of the oldest ways humans sneak criticism into a room where criticism is risky. A light joke slips in, because the alley is warm and your brain deserves a little laugh. Enlil is the person who reads the recipe and follows it exactly. Enki is the person who looks at the recipe, shrugs, and says, we don't have that ingredient. So I'll improvise. And somehow the food is edible. Enlil is upset because the edible food does not prove the recipe wrong. It proves the universe is unfair. You continue into a broader street where the wind returns, tugging at your hair like it wants your attention. It feels like Enlil is saying, yes, cleverness is cute, but we are talking about civilization. And you can almost hear Enki replying, yes, civilization is cute, but we are talking about lives. This split becomes philosophical in a very sleepy, human way. Enlil's moral order is about hierarchy, justice through enforcement, the idea that the cosmos has rules and you do not get to negotiate them. It is stability as an ethical good. Enki's trickster wisdom is about compassion through ingenuity, the idea that rules exist to serve life, not the other way around. It is adaptability as an ethical good. And you, walking between reed walls and brick shadows, begin to see how both can become dangerous if taken too far. Enlil without Enki becomes a world where everything is permitted except breathing. Enki without Enlil becomes a world where everyone is clever and nobody is accountable. which sounds fun until you realize that means nobody can trust anything, ever. You pause near a small courtyard where someone has left a bowl of water out for the morning. The wind is stirring the surface, creating little ripples that catch lamplight. It looks like the two brothers are literally wrestling in a bowl. You smile because myth loves symbolism and reality loves to accidentally provide it. Another light joke, because the bow is doing too much. If Enlil and Enki were roommates, Enlil would label the bowl "Do Not Touch." Enki would touch it, then put it back exactly where it was, and swear he never touched it. The bowl would still be rippling. Enlil would know. Enki would smile. And you would be the exhausted third roommate pretending you do not hear anything because you have work tomorrow. The quirky tidbit in this section comes with a soft warning label in later mystical and modern esoteric interpretations. Enki sometimes gets cast as a liberator figure, while Enlil gets cast as a controller, and people project modern political anxieties onto them. That can be emotionally satisfying, because it turns ancient myth into a clear moral allegory. But the ancient texts are messier. Enki can be manipulative, Enlil can be protective. The point is not to turn them into mascots for your personal ideology. The point is to notice the tension in yourself. Do you crave structure? Do you crave freedom? Do you want consequences? Do you want mercy? You are a walking battleground of these impulses, which is rude, honestly, but also kind of beautiful. Historians still argue how much moral philosophy we should read into these myths versus seeing them as narrative reflections of environmental and social pressures. But even if the stories are partly shaped by irrigation realities and temple politics, they still carry ethical questions, because humans cannot tell a story about power without also telling a story about what power should do. You keep walking and you begin to sense that the brothers' conflict is not always war. Sometimes it is negotiation. Sometimes it is tension held in balance. Sometimes Enlil lays down a hard rule and Enki quietly softens its edge. Sometimes Enki pushes too far and Enlil snaps back. The mythic world stays alive because neither brother fully wins. A single winner universe would be simpler and also unbearable. The wind calms for a moment. The canal's distant murmur becomes more noticeable. Your breathing slows. You feel yourself settling into the rhythm of this ongoing argument, and it becomes almost comforting because it mirrors the way your own mind works at night. Part of you wants to control tomorrow. Part of you wants to let tomorrow happen. Part of you wants to enforce bedtime. Part of you wants to scroll endlessly. Enlil and Enki, in your skull, bickering softly. And as you keep walking, you sense the story leaning toward the scribes next, toward the tablets, toward the way these myths are preserved and reshaped, because the brothers' conflict does not only happen in heaven, it happens in writing, in retellings, in what a scribe chooses to emphasize, and what he quietly lets fade. You follow the street as it narrows again, and the night wraps around you like a robe. Wind and water, rule and loophole, moral order and trickster wisdom. You carry both forward, because the next part of the journey is where the story itself becomes the battleground. You keep walking, but now it feels like you are walking into a room made of words. The city is still here, the canals still murmuring behind walls, the wind still wandering like it owns the place, but your attention shifts to the quieter power that holds everything together, the scribes, the people who make the gods portable, the ones who take storms and springs and arguments and press them into clay so they can survive longer than a human breath. You pass a low building where a lamp still burns, and through a gap in the door you glimpse a hand moving, slow and practiced, stylus pressing wedge after wedge. It is hypnotic. Tap. Press. Lift. Turn the tablet slightly. Tap again. You can almost feel how tired the wrist gets. You can also feel how stubborn the intention is, because writing is effort, and nobody puts in effort like this unless they believe the words matter. Mainstream historical fact, placed gently in the scene. Mesopotamian scribal schools trained students to copy texts, including myths, hymns, proverbs, and administrative records. Many literary compositions were preserved through repeated copying over long periods, and texts could be adapted, edited, or recombined. So the Enki and Enlil you meet in one tablet might have slightly different edges than the Enki and Enlil you meet in another. Not because the gods changed, but because humans changed the way they framed them. You linger near the doorway, not spying, just listening to the scratch of reed on clay, and you start to understand that the brother conflict lives inside that sound. Because every time a scribe copies a myth, he makes choices, even if he is trying to be faithful. The act of copying is never perfectly neutral. Which epithet do you include? Which version do you pick? Which lines get emphasized in teaching? Which get shortened because the student's tablet is too small and the teacher is already tired? Historians still argue how stable certain mythic traditions were across centuries, and how much variation reflects regional differences versus chronological change. In other words, is there a true original Enki versus Enlil story we could recover? Or are we dealing with a living river of narratives that never had a single source spring? The debate matters because it changes how you interpret the brothers. Are their personalities ancient bedrock, or are they partly sculpted by later storytelling needs? You move closer to the scribal house and imagine the shelves, tablets stacked like bricks of memory. Some are school exercises with shaky signs. Some are polished copies meant for temple libraries. Some are old and chipped, edges worn from handling, like a beloved book you reread even though the cover is falling off. In those tablets, Enlil's authority can be expanded or tightened. Enki's cleverness can be softened into kindness or sharpened into scheming. The brothers become, in part, reflections of the scribes who preserve them. A light joke slips in, because the idea of scribes deciding the tone of the gods is both powerful and funny. Imagine being a student scribe, half asleep, copying a line about Enlil's wrath, and accidentally adding an extra wedge that turns mighty into mild. Congratulations. You have just invented a calmer universe. Your teacher will still smack the tablet out of your hands, but for one beautiful moment, Enlil is just slightly less intense. You wander through a courtyard where broken practice tablets lie in a pile, discarded the way you discard drafts. Clay is forgiving. You can recycle it, but the stories you press into it can become surprisingly stubborn. Once a version of a story becomes popular in a temple library, it can influence generations. That is how the brother conflict gets shaped, not only by divine imagination, but by institutional memory. Now the quirky tidbit for this section comes in softly, like a little secret between you and the night. Some texts we have today exist in multiple fragmentary copies, sometimes with differing lines or missing sections, which means scholars reconstruct them like puzzles. That reconstruction process can affect interpretation. One missing line can change whether Enlil sounds like a tyrant or a stern protector. One damaged passage can change whether Enki sounds like a savior or a sly manipulator. You are not only hearing the gods, you are hearing the gaps. You step under a fig tree and feel the leaves shift in the wind, a faint whisper of paper-like sound, and you realize how much this resembles the modern world. We also remix stories, we also retell, we also argue about canon. The only difference is we do it with screens and comment sections instead of clay and temple libraries. The vibe is identical. Humans remain humans. The gods, meanwhile, remain excellent material for debate. Historians still argue about the intent behind certain compositions. Some texts seem to praise Enlil as supreme in a way that could reflect Nippur's theological influence. Others highlight Enki's wisdom and beneficence, reflecting Eridu's legacy and the appeal of a helpful deity. Were these texts meant as devotional literature, political legitimation, teaching tool, or entertainment? Again, probably all of the above. Mesopotamian literature is allergic to single-purpose categories. You imagine a teacher in a scribal school, pointing at a line about Enlil's decree, explaining what it means: obedience, cosmic hierarchy, the importance of maintaining order. Then you imagine another teacher, or the same teacher on another day, pointing at a line about Enki's clever intervention, explaining what it means: wisdom, adaptability, the value of craft and knowledge. The students absorb both. They grow into administrators, priests, advisors. They carry these values into the real world. Myth shapes culture. Culture shapes myth. It is a loop, like water circulating through canals, a light joke. Because you are now imagining teachers, and you deserve a giggle. Scribal school is basically ancient homework hell. You think your handwriting practice was bad. Imagine doing it in wet clay, where every mistake is permanent until you smear the whole tablet and start over. Enki would sympathize and invent an eraser. Enlil would say the lesson is discipline. You keep walking and you start to see the brother conflict as less like a single story and more like a theme that appears across stories. Sometimes Enlil and Enki are explicitly in tension. Sometimes they are simply different tones in the same orchestra. A hymn to Enlil might emphasize his role as the one who decrees fate. A myth involving Enki might emphasize his role as the one who manipulates circumstances. When you place these texts side by side, you're not seeing contradiction. You're seeing a society exploring different dimensions of power. And that brings you to another scholarly debate phrase. Because this one always lingers, historians still argue whether Enki's role as a protector of humans in certain narratives is partly a response to the problem of divine justice, an attempt by storytellers to make the gods seem less terrifying and more relational. If disasters happen, people want a reason. They also want hope. Enki can provide hope without undermining the structure completely, because he can act indirectly. That indirectness is narratively convenient and emotionally soothing. You stop near the scribal doorway again and listen to the stylus. Tap, press, lift. The sound becomes a kind of heartbeat for the myth. Every tap is a choice. Every wedge is a preserved tension. It is almost tender. Realizing that the conflict between Enki and Enlil survives, not because it is the loudest drama, but because it is the most useful drama. It teaches people how to think about authority and compassion, order and innovation, punishment and mercy. Another light joke? Because you're getting a little too tender and you need balance. If a scribe's stylus breaks mid-line, that is basically the ancient version of your laptop dying at 1% battery. You stare at it like, Enki, help. And Enlil's is like, you should have charged it. You step away from the scribal house, carrying the awareness that these brothers are partly made of clay, not only in figurines or temple walls, but in text. Their conflict is curated. Their personalities are amplified or softened. The scribes do not invent the gods from nothing, but they do decide which angles get light. And now, as you move on through the sleeping city, you can feel the next shift coming. Because after all this writing and rewriting, after all these competing emphases, there are moments where the brothers are not purely in opposition. Moments where they cooperate, at least briefly. the way siblings sometimes do when a bigger problem shows up and forces them to act like family. You follow the street into deeper quiet, the wind easing, the canal's murmur steady, and you let the thought settle. The conflict is real. Yes, but it is not constant war. Sometimes it is negotiation. And the next part of the journey is where you catch those rare, almost surprising flashes of collaboration. You keep walking, and the night starts to feel less sharp around the edges, as if the city has decided to stop judging you for existing. The wind is still there, but it is gentler now, less like a command and more like a passing thought. The canal's murmur remains steady, like a quiet friend who does not need to speak much to be comforting. And somewhere in this softened atmosphere, you begin to notice something that has been easy to miss while focusing on the conflict. Sometimes the brothers work together, not often, not dramatically, not in a high-five teamwork montage. More like two forces aligning briefly because the world is complicated and even gods cannot afford constant infighting. It is the kind of collaboration siblings do when the house is on fire. They do not suddenly love each other. They simply agree that survival comes first. Mainstream historical fact, offered in a calm tone. In Mesopotamian mythology, deities are frequently shown acting within assemblies and shared cosmic projects. And different gods can participate in establishing order, distributing roles, or maintaining the functioning of the world. Even when one god is emphasized as supreme in a particular tradition, the pantheon still operates like a network. So moments of Enki and Enlil alignment make sense within the broader structure of divine cooperation. You drift toward a temple courtyard where the stones are cool underfoot. The lamps are fewer here, so shadows deepen. In the center, a shallow basin reflects the stars, and you find yourself thinking again of that image from earlier. Wind stirring water, ripples catching light. It is the simplest picture of their relationship. Enlil moves. Enki responds. Enki flows. Enlil shapes. Even when they are fighting, they are still part of the same system. You imagine stories where the gods have to establish boundaries, create institutions, regulate the cosmos. Enlil, with his authority, can declare and enforce. Enki, with his wisdom, can design and implement. One without the other risks failure. A decree without a plan is just noise. A plan without authority is just a dream. When the brothers collaborate, it is because the cosmos needs both decree and design. Historians still argue whether some apparent collaborations in myth reflect genuine older traditions of balanced divine roles or later theological smoothing, where storytellers and scribes tried to reconcile competing cult priorities by showing the major gods cooperating. In other words, is the harmony original, or is it a diplomatic rewrite? Either way, it reveals something human. People like their universe to feel stable enough that even rival gods can coordinate when it matters. You walk past a door where a family sleeps inside. Their breathing slow, their worries temporarily paused. The sight makes you think of what cooperation means on the ground. When Enlil and Enki are both honored, the city feels protected and supported. The winds will not destroy you, and the waters will not abandon you. The rules will hold, and the cleverness will rescue you when rules are too rigid. That balance is what people crave. Even if they dramatize imbalance in stories because drama sticks, a light joke slips in because the idea of divine teamwork feels almost too wholesome. If Enlil and Enki ever did a joint project, Enlil would bring a binder full of policies, and Enki would bring snacks and a sketch of a canal system drawn on the back of the snack wrapper. Somehow, terrifyingly, it would work. Enlil would never admit it. Enki would never stop smirking. You begin to recognize a pattern in the myths and hymns. Even when Enlil is framed as the ultimate authority, Enki often remains indispensable, even when Enki is the clever fixer. Enlil often remains the one whose approval keeps the fix from becoming outright rebellion. Their cooperation can be reluctant, but it is structurally necessary. The universe they inhabit is too interconnected for strict separation. The quirky tidbit arrives like a small candle flame in the dark. In some traditions, Enki's association with the Abzu and with crafts makes him feel like the god of how, while Enlil feels like the god of why. Enki knows how to do things, how to build, how to solve. Enlil knows why things must be ordered, why boundaries matter, why the cosmos needs hierarchy. The how and the why can argue, but they also need each other. If you have ever tried to build something without a reason, you lose motivation. If you have ever tried to enforce a reason without a method, you fail. You stop near a shrine and notice a simple offering, a small loaf and a cup. It is not labeled for Enlil or for Enki in neon, obviously. But in your imagination, you can see how people might offer to both. Not as a compromise, but as a recognition that life is not single God work. You need rain and you need irrigation. You need law and you need cleverness. You need the storm to stay away and the river to stay generous. So you honor the brothers as complementary forces, even if their myths insist on rivalry. Historians still argue how ordinary worshippers related to these major gods in daily practice versus how elite scribal literature portrays them. The big literary conflicts may have been shaped by temples and schools, while everyday devotion could be more pragmatic and less dramatic. People might have been less interested in who wins and more interested in, please let my child recover, and please don't let the canal collapse. The gods, in real life, are often approached like specialists. You do not go to the storm god for a plumbing issue. You do not go to the water god to adjudicate a land dispute, unless you are desperate, in which case you go to everyone. Because desperation is the original multi-faith practice, another light joke slips in, because you are imagining people praying pragmatically and it is too relatable. Ancient prayer is basically, Dear Enlil, keep my roof intact. Dear Enki, keep my water sweet. Dear whoever is listening, please also help my neighbor stop borrowing my tools. The gods are cosmic, but the requests are always very local. You keep walking, and you begin to feel how cooperation appears even inside conflict, in the flood narratives. For example, Enki saves a remnant, but the post-flood world still requires order. Limits get established. Life continues under new rules. That is an uneasy kind of cooperation. Enki preserves, Enlil regulates. The conflict is not resolved, but it is channeled. The world becomes livable again, not because one brother defeats the other, but because the tension finds a new equilibrium. The wind brushes the basin surface again, and you watch ripples expand. You think of Enlil's storms shaping the land. You think of Enki's waters shaping it too. Both are erosion and creation. Both can destroy. Both can nurture. Their collaboration is not always benevolent. Sometimes it is simply necessary. Sometimes the universe needs pruning. Sometimes it needs planting. And the brothers, together, provide the tools. Historians still argue whether the portrayal of divine assemblies, where gods confer and decree, reflects older mythic imagination or mirrors human political structures like councils and courts. In other words, did people picture gods meeting because they genuinely believed gods met, or because human governance was organized that way and the cosmos was imagined as a bigger version of the palace? Again, likely both. Humans cannot help but build heaven in the shape of their own institutions. You feel yourself settling into a gentler understanding of the brothers. They are not cartoon opposites. They are functions. They are pressures. They are ways of coping with a world that can be generous and cruel in the same season. And sometimes those pressures align, producing stability, not perfect peace, but workable life. Another light joke. Because you're starting to get philosophical and you need a little grounding, Enlil and Enki cooperating is like your brain finally agreeing to go to bed. One part says, "We have responsibilities," and the other says, "We can solve them tomorrow." And for a brief, miraculous moment, both parts nod, and you actually close your eyes. You keep walking into the deeper quiet, and you sense the next shift coming. Because even though cooperation exists, history keeps moving. New empires rise, new languages spread. Old gods get new names and new roles. The brothers' rivalry gets remixed, reinterpreted, repackaged for new political needs. The next part of the story will take you beyond early Sumer, into the later currents that reshape Enki and Enlil like clay under a different hand. The city around you remains ancient, but time itself begins to stretch, preparing to carry you forward. You keep walking, but time starts doing that strange myth thing where it folds like fabric. One street becomes another century without asking permission. The same brick smell stays, the same reed and smoke air. Yet the names on seals change, the accents shift, and the city banners you cannot quite see in the dark start carrying different symbols. It is still Mesopotamia, still the land of canals and dust and stars, but the story's spine lengthens as new powers arrive and decide the gods should wear slightly different faces. This is where later empires come in, not to erase Enki and Enlil, but to remix them. You feel it in the way people speak their names. Enki becomes Ea more often in Akkadian contexts, and the myths start traveling across languages like boats crossing a river. Same cargo, new ropes. Enlil remains Enlil, but his position, titles, and emphasis can be shaped by whoever is holding power, and whichever temple network is strongest in that moment. The brothers stay themselves, but the spotlight shifts, and you can almost hear the stagehands moving the lamps. Mainstream historical fact. Set down quietly. The Akkadian Empire and later Mesopotamian states used Akkadian, a Semitic language, widely, and many Sumerian literary and religious traditions were translated, adapted, or incorporated into Akkadian culture. Scribal culture preserved older Sumerian texts, even as new compositions and standardizations emerged. So when you see Enki, Ea, and Enlil appearing in later sources, you are watching a cultural continuum, not a clean break. You step into an imagined scribal chamber again. But now the tablets on the shelf include bilingual compositions, and the teacher's voice carries different rhythms. Students still press wedges into clay, still get scolded for sloppy signs, still learn that memory is a muscle. The difference is that the myths are now part of a larger, imperial tapestry. A bigger world means bigger needs, a more centralized kingship, broader administration, more diverse populations. And the gods, like all good institutions, get interpreted to match the scale. Enlil's authority can become even more useful in an imperial context. Empires love legitimacy. They love the idea that rule is divinely sanctioned, not just won by force. So Enlil's role as a supreme decreer, a stabilizer, a cosmic administrator, can be emphasized. If you are a king trying to hold together a wide territory, order is not just a value, it is survival. Enlil starts to look like the patron of centralized control, even if that is not the only way to see him. Enki, as Ea, remains essential too, but in a different flavor. Wisdom becomes an imperial tool. Knowledge of rituals, omens, crafts, and the hidden workings of the world matters when you are running a complex society. Ea becomes deeply tied to wisdom traditions, to magic and incantations, to the kind of specialized knowledge that makes you feel safer in a world where you cannot predict the next drought or rebellion. If Enlil is the seal of authority, Ea is the library key. Historians still argue how much of this shift is an actual change in religious belief versus a change in which texts and traditions became most prominent in elite contexts. In other words, did ordinary people start thinking differently about the brothers, or did the scribal and temple institutions simply reorganize the narrative emphasis as politics evolved? The answer is slippery. Like canal water, because popular practice is harder to recover than elite writing. You wander through a mental panorama of cities under different rulers, and the brother conflict becomes less like a single argument and more like a set of themes that can be highlighted depending on the era. In one setting, Enlil's strictness can be framed as essential justice. In another, it can be framed as oppressive rigidity that needs balancing by his wisdom. In one dynasty, a king might favor Enlil's temple network for legitimacy. In another, he might elevate wisdom priests, exorcists, or scholars who draw on his authority. A light joke sneaks in, because you are watching millennia of theology update and your brain wants to compare it to software. This is basically the ancient world's version of a patch update. Enlil gets Authority 2.0. Ea gets Wisdom Tools Expanded. And the scribes are the ones reading the release notes like, fixed, humans too noisy. Added, new ritual for when your neighbor is cursed. You notice, 2, how empires bring mixing. When cultures merge, gods can merge or align or become associated with one another. Titles transfer, functions overlap. The pantheon becomes a diplomatic table where everyone is trying to sit close to power without spilling their drink. In that environment, the Enki and Enlil relationship can be framed in ways that serve coherence. Rivalry might be softened in some contexts to maintain divine unity, while in others, it might be sharpened to dramatize moral tension. The quirky tidbit in this section comes with a sleepy grin. Later, Mesopotamian scholarly traditions, especially those involving incantations and ritual expertise, often elevate the importance of hidden knowledge and specialized wisdom, which can make Ea feel like the god you want on speed dial when the universe is acting up. It is not fringe, exactly, but it edges into that liminal space where religion, magic, and science are not separated the way modern categories insist they must be. In that world, wisdom is not just philosophy, it is protective technology. You keep walking and imagine how the brothers' conflict is retold to match new anxieties. An empire worries about rebellion, so Enlil's authority feels comforting. An empire worries about unseen forces, illness, curses, and bad omens. So Ea's expertise feels comforting. Both gods become sources of stability, just in different registers. The conflict, then, becomes a way to explore competing solutions to instability. Control versus knowledge, another light joke. Because the universe is heavy, and you deserve gentle laugh. Enlil is the one who says, we need a strong policy. Ea is the one who says, we need a strong backup plan. Humans, meanwhile, are still the ones saying, we need a nap. And honestly, that might be the wisest request in any era. You sense that as time moves forward, the myths begin to standardize in some places. Certain versions become canonical in scribal education. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, develops into a standard form that later scholars copy, with Utnapishtim's flood story nested inside it like a preserved relic. That standardization does not erase older variations, but it creates a dominant storyline that shapes how later audiences imagine the gods. Enlil's decree, Ea's warning, The boat, the aftermath, the brothers' conflict becomes a familiar rhythm, like a song everyone knows even if they hum slightly different notes. Historians still argue about the direction of influence between Sumerian originals and Akkadian adaptations, and about what gets lost or transformed in translation. Sometimes a Sumerian nuance becomes an Akkadian emphasis. Sometimes a local deity's importance fades as a more widely recognized divine name takes center stage. Sometimes a story becomes smoother, more coherent, because coherence is easier to teach. And sometimes coherence is exactly what the messy truth refuses to provide. You walk past an imagined royal inscription being carved into stone, the kind that lists accomplishments and divine support. The king claims to have built temples, dug canals, conquered enemies, restored order. The gods are invoked like witnesses. Enlil stands behind the king's authority. Ea stands behind the king's wisdom. The brothers, whether they like it or not, become part of the empire's self-image. A third light joke slides in. Because the king's inscription vibe is intense, if ancient kings had social media, they would post, "Just rebuilt the temple. Thanks Enlil for the legitimacy and Ea for the good ideas." And the comments would be full of people like, "My field is still flooded, though." And the king would ignore it because comments are always a trap. As the night stretches, you feel how the brothers' conflict survives precisely because it is adaptable. New powers can project new meanings onto them without breaking the core tension. Enlil remains the force of decree, structure, and sometimes harsh correction. Ea remains the force of wisdom, resourcefulness, and sometimes sly mercy. Empires rise and fall, but the need to balance order and ingenuity does not disappear. It only changes costume. And as you keep walking, you can sense the next turn waiting like a shadow at the end of a street. Because once the myths have traveled through empires and languages, they eventually reach the modern world, where people retell them again, sometimes carefully, sometimes wildly, sometimes with fringe threads that sparkle like cheap jewelry in moonlight. The next step is where the ancient brothers echo into the internet age, and where you learn how to sift the fun theories from the clay-hard facts without losing the sleepy mood. You keep walking, and the street you are on begins to feel strangely familiar, not because the bricks have changed, but because the way people talk about the gods starts sounding like today. The ancient night is still around you, but you can hear modern voices layered over it, like a second radio station bleeding through. Someone is confidently wrong in the distance. Someone is aggressively certain. Someone is selling you a secret truth with the energy of a late-night infomercial. And you, half asleep and slightly amused, are about to step into the part of the journey where Enki and Enlil get dragged into the modern imagination. This is the internet echo chamber, where old myths become new arguments, and where the brothers' conflict is sometimes explained with care and sometimes explained like a conspiracy ball held together by pure caffeine. Mainstream historical fact. Kept calm. Modern understanding of Enki, Enlil, and Mesopotamian mythology largely comes from archaeological discoveries of cuneiform tablets and scholarly translation and interpretation. The texts are real, but they are fragmentary, varied, and shaped by scribal traditions. That means there is room for interpretation, but there is also evidence. And not every modern claim is anchored in the sources. The brothers do not need hype to be interesting. They are already complicated enough. You pass an imagined stall in the night market of modern ideas, where someone is whispering. Enki was the good one. Enlil was the bad one. Like they just invented moral nuance. Another stall says, actually, Enlil was the hero because he enforced order. Like order never hurt anybody. Another says, they were extraterrestrials. and the stall owner looks at you with that earnest gleam that says they will talk for 40 minutes if you make eye contact. And here is the thing. The fringe threads are not always malicious. Often they are just hungry. Hungry for a clear story. Hungry for a hero and villain. Hungry for a cosmic explanation that feels personal. People look at ancient myths and want them to behave like modern narratives. They want Enki to be the rebellious savior, the one who gave humanity knowledge. They want Enlil to be the oppressive controller, the one who punished humans for waking up. It is emotionally satisfying. It is also, usually, too clean. Historians still argue about interpretive frameworks, even within academia, like how to weigh different versions of a myth, or how to handle gaps, and how to interpret symbolic language such as noise or decrees. So it is not like scholars have everything locked down in a single neat answer. But there is a big difference between debate grounded in texts and debate grounded in vibes. A light joke slips in. Because you are in the modern myth market now and it is mildly chaotic. The internet will take a broken tablet fragment, add 3 dramatic adjectives, throw in the word forbidden, and suddenly you have a 12-part thread titled, "The Shocking Truth." The gods didn't want you to know. Enlil would absolutely file a complaint. Enki would probably click like just to be annoying. Now, the most common modern fringe track you will hear is the Anunnaki as aliens angle, where Enki and Enlil become rival commanders or engineers, fighting over humanity as a genetic experiment. This framing often borrows names and vibes from Mesopotamian mythology, but then fills in massive gaps with modern science fiction logic. It is not supported by ancient sources in the way people claim, but it persists because it is compelling. It gives you clear motivation, clear factions, clear stakes. It turns myth into a space opera with better costumes. Softly, without scolding, you let yourself notice what changes when people do this. In the ancient texts, Enki and Enlil are not primarily about technology. They are about cosmic order, survival, and the relationship between humans and power. When you turn them into aliens, you trade symbolic richness for literal plot. You can still enjoy it as fiction, sure. But if you want to understand the original cultural meaning, you have to keep one foot on the clay. The quirky tidbit in this section is a modern one, and it feels like a mirror. Lots of people today use Enki versus Enlil as a shorthand for freedom versus control, projecting modern political or psychological tensions onto them. That can be insightful as a personal metaphor, but it can also flatten the ancient complexity, because Enki's freedom is not always purely liberating. His cleverness can manipulate. His mercy can be strategic. And Enlil's control is not always purely oppressive. His order can protect. His enforcement can prevent collapse. The ancient story is less like a superhero fight and more like a debate you never fully solve. Historians still argue whether it is fair to interpret ancient gods through modern moral categories at all. Some scholars prefer to describe what the gods do in the texts rather than assign them moral labels, because divine behavior in these myths does not map neatly onto modern ethics. Calling Enlil evil or Enki good can be more revealing about modern desires than about ancient realities. You keep walking and you see, in your mind, 2 different kinds of modern content being made. One is careful, historians, archaeologists, and educators explaining context, noting which stories come from which periods, acknowledging uncertainty. The other is loud, cherry-picked lines presented without context, dramatized, weaponized for a click. The brothers' conflict becomes a meme, a battle of Team Enki versus Team Enlil, as if cosmic order can be settled like a sports bracket. Another light joke, because team anything is always funny when applied to gods. Imagine wearing a Team Enki shirt to a temple of Enlil. The wind would immediately find your shirt collar and use it as a parachute. The priest would pretend not to laugh. Enki would absolutely take credit for the comedy. But here is the soothing part, the part that keeps the bedtime tone intact. Even the modern remixes prove something gentle. These myths still work. They still stick. Enki and Enlil remain emotionally legible. The clever helper, the stern authority. You feel them in your own life, in every rule you resent and every rule you rely on, in every time you need a loophole and every time you need someone to enforce boundaries. That is why people keep retelling their conflict, even if they dress it in alien helmets or motivational quotes. You pause and listen to the night again, trying to hear through the modern noise. The canal is still there. The wind is still there. The ancient city still breathes. And you remember what you have been doing this whole journey, holding two things at once, enjoying the weirdness without losing the grounding, letting the fringe be fun without mistaking it for the foundation. Historians still argue about the best ways to communicate ancient myth to modern audiences without either sanitizing it or sensationalizing it. And you can feel that tension right now. If you make it too dry, people drift away. If you make it too hype, you turn it into something else. Tonight, you are choosing the middle path. Soft, curious, steady, a third light joke slips in. Because you have been very responsible and you deserve a reward. The algorithm is basically Enlil. It decides what is seen. Enki is you and your weird search history, trying to outsmart it with clever keywords. And humanity is everyone yelling, "Why did it recommend this to me?" While continuing to click anyway. You keep walking, and the city's ancient shapes become calmer again, as if the modern voices have faded. The brothers' conflict remains. But it is no longer a hot take. It is a quiet lesson. And you can sense you are nearing the end of the journey, where the rivalry is not resolved like a plot twist, but softened into understanding, into human meaning. Because in the end, Enki and Enlil are not just ancient gods. They are two ways of coping with the same fragile world. You step into a darker street where the stars feel closer, and you feel the story preparing to settle. The last section will not be about winning. It will be about holding the tension gently, letting it teach you something without demanding you pick a side, and then letting the night close around that lesson like a warm blanket. You keep walking, but now the city feels like it is exhaling. The wind is softer, the canal's murmur steadier, and the stars overhead seem less like sharp pinpricks and more like sleepy lanterns hung far away. You have carried this brother conflict through temples and politics, through flood shadows and scribal hands, through empires and modern noise, and what is left now is not a verdict. It is a kind of understanding that settles into your bones like warmth. Because the truth is, Enki and Enlil do not end as winner and loser. They end as a tension that keeps the world livable. You step into an open space where the city walls fall away into darkness and the sky feels huge. You can hear the wind's faint sigh across the plain. You can smell damp earth from somewhere nearby. And you realize this is the simplest stage for them. Air and water, boundary and flow. A world that needs both. Mainstream historical fact. Set down gently for the last time. In Mesopotamian religion, the pantheon functions as an interconnected system, and major gods like Enlil and Enki occupy roles that can overlap, shift in emphasis across time, and be interpreted differently by different communities. Their stories survive because they are useful frameworks for explaining authority, nature, and human vulnerability. The myths do not give you a single moral. They give you a set of pressures to think with. Enlil, in the stories, carries the weight of structure. He is the one who insists the cosmos must have rules. Without rules, the city collapses into chaos. The canals get fought over. The king becomes just another loud man with a weapon, and the fragile line between survival and disaster snaps. Enlil is not gentle, but he is not pointless. He represents the part of life that says, you cannot do anything you want, because what you do affects everyone. Enki carries the weight of adaptation. He is the one who insists the cosmos must have cleverness, mercy, and practical solutions. Without cleverness, rules become cruelty, and punishment becomes destruction, and the system begins to serve itself rather than the lives inside it. Enki is not purely sweet, but he is not empty. He represents the part of life that says, rules are tools, and tools are meant to help living beings, not crush them. Historians still argue whether the Enki and Enlil tension reflects a deliberate theological exploration of justice versus mercy, or whether it is primarily a byproduct of competing cult centers and evolving political needs. But the debate itself is part of the meaning. Even scholars, even centuries later, feel the pull of these two poles: order and flexibility, authority and ingenuity. The argument persists because it maps onto real human dilemmas that do not stop being real just because time passes. You walk along the edge of a canal again because it feels right to end where water is near. The surface is calm, reflecting a slice of sky. A breeze ripples it, and the ripples spread outward, touching everything. It makes you think of how the brothers affect human life. You do not have to be a king or a priest to feel their influence. You feel it when you need boundaries. You feel it when you need mercy. You feel it when you crave safety, and you feel it when you crave freedom. A light joke slips in, because even at the end, you deserve a soft smile. If Enlil and Enki were two apps on your phone, Enlil would be settings, and Enki would be shortcuts. One keeps the system stable. The other lets you hack your way into convenience. You need both. You just wish they would stop updating at the same time. The quirky tidbit in this final section comes like a quiet lantern in the distance. Some modern thinkers and storytellers treat Enki and Enlil as archetypes for the two sides of governance itself. The hard power of enforcement and the soft power of persuasion and problem-solving. That is not ancient doctrine. It is a modern lens, but it can be useful if you remember it is a lens, not a replacement for the clay. The clay tells you they are gods with messy personalities, shifting relationships, and stories that refuse to be flattened. You slow your pace, because the night feels thicker now, and the end of the journey is close. The city's sounds are fewer. A distant owl calls once. Somewhere, a door shuts softly. The wind moves through reeds and makes that gentle brushing sound that always feels like the world whispering to itself. You think again of the flood story, of Enlil's decree and Enki's loophole mercy, and you realize that even there, the story is not one brother bad, one brother good. It is, the universe must regulate, and the universe must preserve. Those are two truths that can clash. And humans, listening, learn that a world with only regulation is suffocating, and a world with only preservation can become unstable. The myth is teaching you balance, but it teaches it the way life teaches, through friction. Historians still argue whether the noise theme is about population, independence, or cosmic disruption. And you can let that debate sit without needing to solve it. Because the emotional meaning remains clear even when the academic details remain contested. Too much noise, too much disruption and system strain, too much silence, too much control, and life shrinks. The trick is not to eliminate noise or eliminate rules. The trick is to find the living middle. A second light joke drifts in, because your brain is probably picturing balanced scales now. Enlil is the part of you that makes a to-do list. Enki is the part of you that finishes the to-do list by creatively redefining what finish means. Together, you become functional. Separately, you either become a robot or a chaos gremlin. Choose your fighter. Actually, no. Keep both. That is the secret. You reach a small embankment where the canal widens slightly, and you sit down, letting the cool air settle on your skin. The bricks behind you are warmish still. The water in front of you is cool. The wind above you is mild. It feels like the 3 layers of the cosmos are all present at once. And for a moment, the brothers' rivalry feels less like a fight and more like a choreography. You imagine Enlil easing his grip, not because he stops caring about order, but because he recognizes order without compassion becomes brittle. You imagine Enki easing his mischief, not because he stops valuing loopholes, but because he recognizes loopholes without accountability become corrosive. You imagine them not hugging it out. Because let's be real, these are ancient gods, not a sitcom finale. But you imagine them existing in the same world without constantly trying to cancel each other. And you, listening in the dark, take the lesson into your own quiet life. When you feel yourself tightening into control, hey, you remember Enki's water, the way it finds a path. When you feel yourself drifting into chaos, you remember Enlil's wind, the way it pushes and shapes. You do not have to worship them to let their story remind you that extremes are exhausting. Balance is restful. Now the pacing begins to slow even more, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. The city in your mind becomes less detailed, softer at the edges. The streets blur into gentle lines. The temples become silhouettes. The palace walls become just dark shapes against a night sky. The canal becomes a ribbon of quiet movement, and the wind becomes a barely there breath. You let your shoulders drop. You let your jaw unclench. You let the last of the story settle like silt at the bottom of a river, clear water above it. You do not need to hold on to every detail. You do not need to win the argument for either brother. You can simply carry the feeling of the myth that life is kept alive by both structure and wisdom, both boundary and flow, both the stern wind and the clever water. And as the stars seem to drift farther away, as the city's sounds fade into a soft hush, you picture Enki and Enlil not as enemies locked in endless combat, but as 2 ancient forces circling the same fragile world, keeping it from tipping too far in either direction. Your breathing slows. The canal keeps murmuring. The wind keeps sighing. The night keeps holding you. End of script. Sweet dreams.